Hello, good morning. This is Sky News Breakfast, live from Chernihiv, near Poland's main border crossing with Ukraine. As the stream of refugees escaping the fighting continues, we'll bring you the latest throughout the morning as the conflict enters its 10th day, and we'll report on the growing humanitarian crisis from both sides of the border. President Zelenskyy criticises NATO for not implementing a no-fly zone over Ukraine as Russia continues to assault the northern city of Chernihiv.
Today, the alliance has given the green light to the bombing of Ukrainian cities and villages by refusing to create a no-fly zone.
I'm live in western Ukraine, in Lviv. Tens of thousands of people are once again expected to arrive in this city today. Some of them will flee across the border and others will stay in shelters like this one.
Russia blocks access to Facebook and Twitter as some foreign media outlets suspend reporting in the country. £55 million raised in one day by UK charities as hundreds of thousands donate to help people fleeing the war.
And in other news, tributes are paid to a cricketing icon, Shane Warne, who has died at the age of 52. And later we'll be discussing today's front pages with the journalists and broadcasters Afua Hagen and Thomas Copeland.
Hello, good morning. As Ukrainians wake up to the 10th day of the Russian invasion, their president has accused NATO of weakness and lack of unity. Volodymyr Zelenskyy voiced his anger at the organisation's refusal to implement a no-fly zone over his country. But in the last few moments, Russian media is reporting that the Russian Defence Ministry will open humanitarian corridors for residents of Mariupol. We'll bring you more on that as we get it. Well, this comes as a large explosion lit up the night sky in Chernihiv, and Ukrainian officials say a third round of peace talks could take place this weekend. Let's look at the key points. Well, we're expecting President Zelenskyy to speak to the US Senate this afternoon at around 2:30 UK time. Russia is attacking a number of cities. Chernihiv in the northeast has faced a number of strikes. At least 47 people are known to have died there so far. Meanwhile, Russia's communications regulator has blocked Facebook and Twitter for what it's claimed was restricted access to Russian media on all platforms. And it comes as refugees continue to flee to neighbouring countries. Well over 1 million people have left so far. Sally Lockwood has this report.
Bombing in the northern city of Chernihiv has intensified. Thousands of residents spending another long night in underground shelters. You can hear the man who filmed this on his mobile phone say this is absolutely terrifying. Moscow denies targeting civilian areas, but in the village of Bashiv, less than 40 miles from the capital Kiev, these decimated apartment blocks tell a different story. Ukraine has been plunged into a living hell in less than 2 weeks. And in a nighttime address to the nation, a war-weary president accused NATO of not doing enough.
All the people who die from this day forward will also die because of you, because of your weakness, because of your lack of unity. Today, the alliance has given the green light to the bombing of Ukrainian cities and villages by refusing to create a no-fly zone.
Russian bombardments have stepped up in cities across Ukraine. Smoke rising from these warehouses just 12 miles from Kiev. In his latest address, President Putin said there are no bad intentions towards our neighbours. But this is what Ukrainians are seeing. A missile exploding over blogger Nikita Domenikov as he updated his followers. Ukraine's president wants to close the country's airspace to save its citizens from attacks like this. But a no-fly zone has once again been ruled out by the US Secretary of State.
The only way to actually implement something like a no-fly zone is to send NATO planes into Ukrainian airspace and to shoot down Russian planes. And that could lead to a full-fledged war.
A third round of talks between Ukraine and Russia will be held over the weekend. There's been no breakthrough so far, but a tentative agreement for safe humanitarian corridors, which is something.
Why did I leave today? Because it's terrifying. Now there is a threat of a nuclear explosion. Troops are approaching Kiev. That's why there's a crowd like this. People just want to live.
It's a devastating sight to witness. Another father sending his family to safety while he stays to fight. This war, now into a second week, is wreaking havoc and heartbreak on a nation. Sally Lockwood, Sky News.
Well, over the last few days, we've seen a number of companies pulling out of Russia, and we've seen a number of financial sanctions. But in the last few moments, PayPal has announced that it is now adding itself to that list. It is suspending all services in Russia, so no PayPal ability to pay for things in Russia. Well, I'm here on the Polish side of the border. You can see people gathering around some makeshift braziers that they've got going on here. It is a really freezing cold morning this morning. A lot of people here behind me have slept in an old disused Tesco's building overnight. They're being offered warm drinks and warm food while they're waiting for transport on to their next location. And many of those will have come from Lviv in Ukraine, where our Europe correspondent Adam Parsons is. Adam, what's the situation there this morning?
Cold, as you just said, Jane. It's snowing. It's going to stay like this over the course of the day. And once again, Lviv is bracing itself for an influx of people. It's very hard to know how many people come into this city every day. I've seen estimates ranging from 30,000 to 100,000. Now, just to put that into some kind of context, when we look at another migrant story we're very familiar with, which is migrants crossing the English Channel, it's estimated last year 28,000 people made that journey in boats. More than that number come into this city, Lviv, every day at the moment by the most conservative estimate. And the city, frankly, is struggling to cope with them. It's doing an extraordinary job of resilience and creating shelters like this one. This is an ad hoc shelter for displaced people. We're going to go and talk to some of those people later on, partly because the person who actually owns that building has asked us to. He thinks it's his duty, he thinks it's their duty to tell their story to the world. And Ukraine, I think, is desperate that people know what is happening here. It is that combination that we talked about of resilience on the one hand and then increasing weariness on the other. Because as you go into the city, you see long lines of people who are making that difficult choice. Do they flee? Do they come to Poland or head maybe to Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, Moldova, mainly to Poland? There's a train line that goes from Lviv over to near where you are on the Polish border. Or do they stay here? Do they maybe stay in Lviv, a big city? Do they try and get to areas around it? Those, of course, are generally the women and the children. The men are signing up in huge numbers to volunteer to join the armed forces. And we have seen, yesterday, we saw hundreds and hundreds of people joining a queue outside a recruitment office in order to just sign up and to get, effectively, put their name on the list. Not everybody who's signing up is actually just straight getting on a bus and doing some training. We met a man who's actually dotted around, signing up in different places, desperate to serve his country. And that, I think that is sort of esprit de corps comes through from so many conversations that you are having with people here in Ukraine. They think they are going to win this war. They think they will repel Russia. They see the same pictures that we see. Or, once again you hear this, they think they should die trying. It's an incredible sort of intoxicating feeling amongst many of particularly the men here. You don't see very many women signing up, although I should say there's a lot of women in the Ukrainian armed forces, an army that was already 200,000 strong, third biggest army in Europe after Russia and France, and has hundreds of thousands of reservists. But of course, pitched against them is the Russian military machine, vast, numerous, although, as we've seen from that column heading towards Kyiv, lumbered by some pretty unreliable machinery. And that battle between the absolute determination of the Ukrainian people and this Russian military might is leading to all of these ghastly scenes that we've seen, whether it's in Kharkiv, whether it's on the outskirts of Kiev and in Mariupol, which is now we're hearing about this offer of a humanitarian corridor being put in there, and the tension that you clearly see in places like Odessa and in the heart of Kiev, where they await a Russian attack. Ukrainians, like so many of us, simply don't know what is going to happen. They don't know what Vladimir Putin's plan is. They are going to resist, but it is that sense of nervousness and of not knowing the future that I think energizes some of them, but exhausts and terrifies many others.
Adam, thanks so much for that. Well, war is raging in Ukraine for now a 10th day as Russian troops besiege and bombard cities. Let's bring you an overview of how the conflict is playing out across the country. Well, the UN atomic watchdog has warned that the world narrowly averted a nuclear catastrophe after Russia's attack on the Zaporizhzhia power station, responsible for 20% of Ukraine's electricity. Elsewhere in the country, Russian forces are now advancing on the city of Mykolaiv, close to the crucial economic hub of Odessa. In the north, just outside the capital, 7 people, including 2 children, were reportedly killed in a strike in a village on the outskirts of Kiev. Authorities in Borodyansk say that they fear 100 people may be buried under rubble after an airstrike. And the attacks are continuing to target the capital, Kiev. But in the last few minutes, the Ministry of Defence has issued an update on Ukraine, and they are saying that the overall rate of Russian air artillery strikes observed over the last 24 hours has been lower than in previous days. Ukraine continues to hold the key cities of Kharkiv, Chernihiv and Mariupol. There have been reports of street fighting in Sumy. It's highly likely that all 4 cities are encircled by Russian forces. Russian forces are probably advancing on the southern port of Mykolaiv. There is a realistic possibility that some forces will attempt to circumvent the city to prioritise progression towards Odessa. And we've also heard in the last few minutes of this humanitarian corridor that is being opened up from Mariupol, and we believe that Russian forces have now paused their attacks to allow people to get out of that city. Well, I'm joined now by the Economic Secretary to the Treasury, Glen. This news that there is now some kind of humanitarian corridor possibly opening up out of Mariupol, it is encouraging, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's obviously very welcome, but set within the context of all that we've heard over the last week and seen from your brave reporters across the region. I mean, there is only one way that this can really definitively be dealt with, and that is for Russia to withdraw and to come to terms with the fact that this is an illegal war and the world is outraged. But this humanitarian route is welcome, and it comes alongside endeavours by many countries to try and find supportive measures to help the Ukrainian people at this difficult time.
But those supportive measures, it's been made very clear, hasn't it, from the UK, from the EU and NATO, don't include a no-fly zone. And we've had another statement from President Volodymyr Zelenskyy overnight. He said that everyone who dies will die because of you as well, talking about those countries that will not help with a no-fly zone. Do you regret that stance? Do you regret the fact that we are not helping?
Well, I think everyone's hearts go out to the Ukrainian people as they bravely come to terms with this aggression from Russia. But we do have to think carefully about how we deal with the reality of the escalation that would clearly be at risk of ensuing if we supported in that way. And as the Secretary of State Blinken said in the clip that you showed a few minutes ago, that would clearly be construed as an act of war and would lead to an escalation, and who knows where that might end. So, of course, one's incredibly sympathetic. The British government's incredibly sympathetic and is doing everything it can to offer practical support outside of that no-fly zone request. But that escalation risk is obviously very real and one that NATO will be very aware of.
Having said that, President Putin's forces hit a nuclear power plant yesterday. How much more escalation do you need?
Well, of course, the world condemns that. I mean, this was a new type of warfare. I think there's increasing evidence that Putin's military are targeting civilians, or certainly being very indiscriminate in the way that they're prosecuting this illegal war. And the use of an attack on a nuclear facility, the largest in Europe, I believe, is obviously hugely concerning and is to be condemned. And that's why across all of Putin's activities here in the Ukraine, we can see that we've got to scrutinize it very carefully. And the ICC is looking at the instances of potential war crimes. But this is a nasty military war that is really beyond anything that many people thought possible of Putin. I'm here in Salisbury. 4 years ago, he attacked some of my constituents. I've been very aware of what he's capable of. But I mean, what he's done in the Ukraine is a new level of aggression. And this is an illegal war, and the way he's prosecuting it is true to our worst fears of what Putin is capable of.
But given that, and given what we know about the way that President Putin operates, the Conservative Party has continued to take an awful lot of money from Russian donors over the years, hasn't it? Now, in hindsight, do you think that was a mistake?
Well, I think all donations have to comply with the law. So the law has always been held to with all donations to all political parties. And we've taken very strong action over the last few weeks. I'm the city minister. We've worked very closely with our allies in the US and the EU to be aligned on the interventions that we've taken in our financial system. We work closely with the Bank of England and regulators to make sure that we've frozen out the Russian businesses and economic actors. And we've seen that reflected in the loss of the ruble's value, the fact that the Russian stock exchange hasn't been able to open for over a week. And just last night, the Foreign Secretary brought forward new measures to allow us to move more swiftly to deal with those entities that will be sanctioned. So we are looking at every single option across whole range of matters across the economy, banning access to insurance, and doing everything we can to reduce the scope for economic activity of the Putin regime. And that does mean targeting those that have enabled him to continue in power all these years.
Would it lead to the Conservative Party giving back some of the donations that it's accepted over the years?
Well, as I said, all those donations and all donations to all political parties have to comply with the law. And I mean, I can't speak to individual donations or to individuals. I mean, what I can say is that all of those donations to all political parties have to comply with the law.
OK. Good to talk to you today, John Glen, MP, Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Thank you very much for joining us on Sky News. Now, G7 foreign ministers have said that those responsible for Russian military attacks on civilians in Ukraine must be held accountable amid reports of the use of cluster bombs and other weapons. Well, I'm joined now by the Ukraine and Russian senior researcher at Human Rights Watch Europe and Central Asia Division, Yulia Gorbanova, who is currently in the western Ukrainian city of Lviv. Good to talk to you today, Yulia. How are you? What is the situation in Lviv at the moment, as you know?
Hi, it's quiet in terms of fighting, but as you know, there are thousands and thousands of people fleeing from other parts of Ukraine that have been affected by very intensive fighting over the last week, and we are seeing a lot of people here that are extremely traumatized, that have witnessed their houses destroyed. Some of them had people in their family killed or injured. And just we're seeing enormous civilian suffering here on the ground.
We heard allegations made public yesterday about the raping of pregnant women in the Donbass region. Was that something that you at Human Rights Watch were aware of?
We do not have any confirmed reports of that. However, in any conflict, sexual violence, gender-based violence in general usually spikes. And we continue to monitor this situation specifically because that's something, unfortunately, that tends to happen quite a lot in an armed conflict.
I mean, when we look at human rights, the bombing of civilians, shooting civilians in their cars is clearly a breach of their human rights. What about what Russia's new tactic appears to be, this surrounding of cities and placing the civilians under siege?
It's extremely disturbing to see because we have recently published a report on the situation in Kharkov. And what we're seeing in Kharkov is that in violation of international law that governs conduct of war, Russian forces have been indiscriminately shelling civilian areas, so areas where there are no military targets. They are populated by regular people, by civilians, and a lot of people have died or been injured as a result. Vital infrastructure have been damaged or destroyed. We've spoken to the office of the mayor of Kharkov just 2 days ago, and he told us that hundreds of residential buildings have been severely damaged or otherwise damaged, and people lost their homes. But also the educational facilities have been damaged. So schools and kindergartens, dozens of those have been destroyed by artillery strikes or shelling. And indiscriminate shelling is prohibited by international law, and use of certain types of weapons, such as cluster munitions, is prohibited by international law for the reason that some of these weapons cannot be targeted precisely. So even if a warring party is trying to hit a military target, they're very likely to also affect civilians because the area of impact is so large. So, for instance, with cluster munitions, a lot of sub-munitions not explode on impact, and they basically spread around in a very large area, the size of a football field, roughly, and effectively become mines that can explode later. And we've seen that happening in early stages of the conflict when there were intensive hostilities and intensive fighting in Donbass in 2014, 2015, 2016. And unfortunately, we're seeing same tactics being used now, and civilians suffer enormously. And we are very concerned that as these hostilities will escalate, there will be more violations of international law in terms of weapons that are used, ill treatment of POWs, gender-based violence and sexual violence, and other violations that affect civilians gravely.
It is a gloomy picture. Yulia Gorbachevna, thank you very much for joining us from Lviv. Well, as Ukrainians flee their homes, communities in the UK are pulling together to provide aid for those affected by the invasion. In just one day, charities have raised £55 million. Katerina Vitozzi has this report.
Bag after bag, box after box, out of incredible suffering has come this moving human kindness.
Look, hand-knitted cardigan, look.
Tom Jackson and sister Jenny Hancock have family in Ukraine and set up this aid collection point in a local workshop. For days now, there's been endless donations.
It's been incredibly moving, and we're just really proud to be a part of it, to be honest.
We've been working with the Ukrainian Centre in Manchester, but at the moment we've completely swamped them out, and now they've got this bottleneck now where they're struggling to get things over to the Ukraine, or even Poland.
If there is some haulage company out there who would be willing to accept the goods and get it to the Polish border where it's desperately needed, that would just be amazing.
We need a true trolley. We've got the trolley.
People have been moved to act in ways both big and small. Charity DEC saw £55 million raised in just 24 hours. This coffee shop is donating a day's profits.
People are seeking ways to just act and to show kindness. And I think that just, being able to purchase a coffee and have a quick chat, but whilst doing good is so meaningful to so many. It's overwhelming how generous people are.
Generous and aware.
I loved the messages of staying strong. There's been some fantastic hope and strength messages coming out through those.
Pupils at this Manchester school want Ukrainian children to know they are not forgotten.
Children my age and younger as well, they're leaving. It's really sad and upsetting.
My message that I put on the wall was for both sides, like Russia and Ukraine, to choose harmony instead of destruction, and for the people to stay strong, because just imagine a week ago the kids in Ukraine were learning about algebra, and now the houses are being bombed.
In a complex world, walls can sometimes divide. This one is all about support. Katerina Vitozzi, Sky News in Manchester.
Well, Facebook and Twitter have been blocked in Russia as the Kremlin continues its efforts to block Russians receiving independent information about the invasion of Ukraine. Our reporter, Katie Barnfield, joins me from the newsroom now. And Katie, this has even forced the BBC to broadcast some of its things on the dark web.
It has indeed, Jane. Good morning. Well, this move by the Russian state communications regulator against Facebook appears to be a retaliation for Facebook's decision to restrict access to Russian state media in countries across Europe, including here in the UK, because of fears they were spreading Russian propaganda. Now, the Russian regulator says it has decided to block access to Facebook because of 26 cases of what it calls discrimination against Russian media outlets, and says it's also taken action against Twitter because that platform would not take down content that had been banned by the Russian authorities. Now, of course, this move has been widely condemned outside of Russia as yet another attempt to block the access of civilians to independent information about the invasion of Ukraine. Now, the White House has said that it is deeply concerned about this. We've also heard from Meta's Global Affairs President, Sir Nick Clegg, which is the company that owns Facebook. He has said today, soon millions of ordinary Russians will find themselves cut off from reliable information, deprived of their everyday ways of connecting with family and friends, and silenced from speaking out. We will continue to do everything we can to restore our services so they remain available to people. Now, this is against a backdrop of the BBC News and other global media outlets deciding to suspend their reporting from Russia temporarily to try and protect their journalists because of a new law that's come in, which effectively threatens them with jail for publishing stories that are critical of the Kremlin. And as you say, this has now prompted the BBC to encourage Russians to access its content on the dark web through a browser called Tor to try and get around Russian state censorship. So, very difficult situation for people living in Russia at the moment, increasingly hard for them to access accurate information about what is happening as this war continues.
Katie, thanks very much for bringing us all that update. Coming up next on Sky News, I'm going to be joined by a journalist for the Kiev Independent who, despite attacks by the Russian army, continues to report on the situation on the ground. And being heard from the centre of the capital of Kiev, and while the city remains under Ukrainian control, a vast Russian military convoy is positioned close by. Well, let's talk now to Asami Terejima. She's a journalist reporting for the Kiev Independent who is now in Lviv. Really lovely to talk to you, Asami. We spoke last week and you were staying in Kiev. You said you wanted to, but now you've moved to Lviv. How was that journey and how are you?
So it was really difficult for me to move. I left with a heavy heart because I wanted to stay in Kiev, but we don't know what the infrastructure is going to be like. So I decided to move to Lviv, and the trains are very packed. There's lots of people, thousands of people waiting at the train station because lots of trains get cancelled, and because the train tickets are free, it just whoever gets in. So so at the platform, it's really crazy because everyone is running to the trains as if it's the last train that there will ever be, even though we all know that there will be more trains in the future.
And we've heard this morning about Russia saying that it's pausing its activities to allow people to leave Mariupol, kind of creating a bit of a human corridor. What are you able to tell us about that? What are the Ukrainian authorities saying?
So there hasn't been a confirmation from the Ukrainian side yet, but we also need to be careful because yes, both cities are a humanitarian catastrophe. People are hiding in the basement without food, water, electricity, heat, and they're living in a very bad condition, and they're really in need of help. But at the same time, Russia's strategy initially was targeting primarily on military objects, but now they seem to be targeting a lot more on civilians because they've been bombing more residential areas, and we need to make sure that we need a humanitarian corridor, but at the same time we need to keep an eye on the situation.
Do you think you'll be able to go back to Kiev?
I would really like to because it's a city that I love, and I would like to report from the epicenter of the conflict, but I also need to continue updating the site, and I don't know about what's going to happen with the Wi-Fi, and I'm more of a political reporter, so I'm not trained enough to really report in the combat zone.
And in terms of the future, Lviv sort of feels obviously much safer than Kiev and Mariupol, but are you concerned that the Russians will just continue to head west and you'll be forced to move on from where you are now even?
So yes, we don't know. I mean, we don't know like what's going to happen to Lviv either. I'm not concerned because I'm more concerned about other cities like Mariupol, Kharkiv, and what happened with Kherson. Russians already like spreading its fake propaganda to the city. Obviously, people will not believe it, but it's in a very bad condition. So I'm worried about those cities and what's going to happen to Kiev. But Lviv, I think it's safe for now. But we don't know what's going to happen. But I'm not as concerned about what could happen to Lviv. I'm more concerned about the situation that's already unfolding in these cities in the east and in Kiev and in the north.
And your president has appealed to the West for support with a no-fly zone. It doesn't appear to look like it is going to happen. How do you feel, and how do your colleagues feel about this?
Well, I mean, we all expected this because we knew that NATO and also the State Secretary Anthony Blinken would reject this. But at the same time, we also agree with President Zelenskyy that it's the same as giving a green light for further Russian bomb. Giving a green light for Russians to further bomb Ukrainian cities, and obviously we are very concerned and we want a no-fly zone over Ukraine. But this seems to have like almost 0% of happening.
We are seeing an enormous humanitarian effort, though, aren't we? Where I am on the Polish border, just so much stuff that is being donated. There's such a willingness for people to help Ukrainians, which is really heartwarming. But essentially all that the people who are where you are and are leaving want to do is to go back home, isn't it?
Yes, we all want to go back home, and I spoke to people at the train station as well, and many of them were in shock. They wanted to stay here, but they don't want to go anywhere. But they know that Kiev is, every day Kiev is becoming more dangerous, and they want to. Many of them have also gone back to their families in different cities, even though Kiev has become home for them. So everyone was leaving with a very heavy heart. The train station, there's lots of people, but people were like more quiet because they're going through a lot. And I was also very. It was really difficult for me as well. So we kind of I think we all felt the same thing.
Asami Terejima, stay safe, and it's lovely to talk to you again. Thanks very much for joining us on Sky News. In the last few moments, we've seen the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, leave Brussels. He was, of course, there for NATO talks yesterday. He's moving on to Poland today. He's going to meet the Polish Foreign Minister, Zbigniew Rau, today. He's also going to be going on to Moldova after that. I'm going to hand you back to Kamali in the studio for a little while, but we'll be back at the top of the hour.
Absolutely right. Thank you very much for that, Jane. Plenty more from the Polish border later on today. All right, well, Jackie is here with us, and of course, Jackie, everyone in the sporting world is talking about Shane Warne. I think we might have actually a picture of the ball
of the century.
Which, again, it just blows my mind when I think about this. That was his first ball in the Ashes.
I still can't talk about the story, actually. I can't believe that someone who is so full of vitality and life and looked in the shape of his life as well, you know. I mean, he used to be a chubby cricketer, let's be honest, and then he suddenly, you know, transformed himself. And it's just really hard to... It was just so hard to read that news, that he died of a heart attack on holiday. He's a once-in-a-lifetime cricketer, certainly a once-in-a-lifetime bowler. You know, the greatest leg spinner of all time, the king of spin. He's the second greatest wicket-taker of all time, behind Matthias Muralitharan, with 708 Test wickets. And, you know, his record in Ashes Test, I mean, he obviously lived to play the Ashes, was just extraordinary. You know, the ball of the century, as you said, was his sort of introduction to Ashes cricket, and what an amazing introduction that was.
Well, you'll know that someone like Shane Warne has been practising that kind of ball with his brothers and with his friends in the street all his life. So to be able to do it the first time he goes out in the Ashes is just incredible.
I don't know if he did practice all his life, because he really wanted to be a footballer. He really wanted to play Aussie rules, and it was the devastation of not making it as a pro, you know, player that, you know, turned him on to cricket, and that's when he really sort of honed his skills. And I think, you know, his sort of rise in cricket happened really, really quickly. He was just he was just gifted, you know, absolutely gifted, because what he did with the ball, other people clearly couldn't do, no matter how many times they practiced. 7 years at Hampshire, you know, beloved by British cricket fans, not just Aussie cricket fans. I mean, the guy just transcended the sport, really. He was a proper superstar with huge charisma and a huge aura about him. I interviewed him a couple of years ago before COVID hit, and although, you know, I'd met him a couple of times, you chat to him for 5 minutes and you feel like you've known him your whole life. He just really makes you feel very comfortable, so friendly, and I think he was just a really, really genuinely nice bloke from Melbourne who never, ever changed. He was always the same, whether he was hanging out the back having a fag with the cleaners or, you know, mixing with royalty. He was just always the same. I just think incredibly sad news. And I think, you know, for the Australians, waking up to this news this morning, because it would have happened pretty much in the middle of their night yesterday, I mean, they must be, you know, in shock all over again. We've pretty much had a day to get used to it, but, you know, they must be incredibly shocked. The young players in the Australian team now obviously didn't play with him because it was a different era, but they would definitely have had him, you know, posters on their walls, and they would have tried to copy his hair and, you know, the bowling action and all the rest of it. And Pat Cummins was definitely one of those players who idolised Shane Warne.
We all grew up watching Warnie, idolising him. We all had posters on his wall, had his earrings. We love so much about Warnie. You know, his showmanship, his charisma, his tactics, the way he just willed himself and the team around him to win games for Australia. And probably, above all else, his incredible skill as a leg spinner. There's so many guys in this team and squad who, you know, still hold him as a hero, their all-time favourite player. And the loss that we're all trying to wrap our heads around is huge.
Yeah, the current captain there really showing how upset he is by the loss of Shane Warne.
I actually reached out to a lot of players and said, you know, will you come on and talk to us? And, you know, Kevin Pearson, for example, was like, I can't talk about it.
They're all cut up, aren't they? You see that with Mike Gatting yesterday when he was on Sky. Yeah.
I can't talk about it, it's too raw, I can't talk about it.
Really, such an impact that Warne had. All right, well, look, sport and war, unfortunately, mixing in Ukraine with that Russian invasion. I know you've been speaking to a Ukrainian tennis player who's now picked up a rifle, right?
Yeah, we've been following his story because I spoke to him last week. He was trying to get back to Kiev, having been on a family holiday in Dubai, get his family to safety, get back to Kiev, and he'd signed up with the Territorial Army, so he wanted to get a gun and start fighting. And Sergei Stakhovsky did manage to get back to Kiev, caught up with him yesterday. And the question, one of the questions I was asking him, and you can see the full interview at 9:35, was, have you heard from Russian tennis players? Have they been in contact with you? Because, the sports world, Russia-wise, has been very, very quiet speaking out about this war, apart from the odd couple of people.
Well, they've got the world's #1 tennis player, haven't they, at the moment?
They have got the world's #1 tennis player, who they've said a little bit, but they've said quite a little. This is what Sergei said. He actually wasn't expecting Russian players to speak out, and this is why.
None of them wants war, but it's very hard for them. For some of them, saying no war or stop war, it's already a very thin line declaration for the Russian state. It is very hard for professional athletes to call out the regime because they still have relatives in that country which can be endangered. So I cannot really ask from tennis players to come out and say what they want to say. It's impossible.
Okay, Jackie, for now, thank you very much for that. Well, let's just bring you some breaking news coming into us here at Sky News. In the past couple of minutes, the City Council of Mariupol, as you understand it, that's a city, of course, in the southeast of Ukraine that's been under Russian encirclement for the past few days, says that they are now beginning to evacuate citizens. There was some reporting from Russian news agencies a couple of hours ago that a humanitarian corridor had been opened for the city of Mariupol. So the city council now saying that they're about to start an evacuation. We'll bring you more detail on that as we get it throughout the morning. But for now, let's take a look at the day's weather here.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Now, there'll be more rain coming to eastern parts of England today, but Sunday looks like it'll be fine and dry. It'll be a cold start for many this weekend, with a widespread frost across Ireland, Northern Ireland and Western Scotland. Early rain over eastern England will become increasingly confined to East Anglia and the southeast. Other eastern and central parts of England will be grey. Elsewhere, it'll be dry with plenty of sunshine, but the odd shower is possible. Northern Scotland, South Wales and the southwest look most at risk from those showers. It'll be chilly and breezy under the cloud. Now, the afternoon will bring about little change, but more of eastern England can expect outbreaks of rain.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, coming up on Sky News Breakfast, we'll take a look at the morning's papers with the journalists and broadcaster Afua Hagen and Thomas Copeland in a couple of minutes. Pleased to say that the journalists and broadcasters Afua Hagen and Thomas Copeland are with us again. Thank you again for being with us, guys. Afua, we're going to start with you. You've picked out a story from the Daily Mail, which is very close to us here at Sky News. Our colleagues coming under fire in Ukraine doing their work. Just take us through what's happening. If viewers do want to see that, it's on skynews.com right now.
Oh, absolutely. So this is a report that I saw last night on Sky News, and the Sky News chief correspondent was out in the field with a crew of about 5. There was 5 people in the crew altogether, and they came under fire from what's called a Russian death squad. So they were in a village just outside of Kiev, the capital, just trying to see what was going on there. And they came under heavy fire from this Russian death squad. And these death squads have been firing at Ukrainians who are trying to leave in their cars. And I'm not sure if they mistook the Sky News crew for Ukrainians trying to leave, or frankly, they knew they were pressed and just decided to fire on them. But they came under heavy fire, everyone in the crew. Now, the cameraman kept filming amazingly. And what struck me about this piece was that I'm sure they weren't calm, but they came across as being so calm in that moment. There was a lot of swearing that was bleeped out, but I mean, I'm sure I would have been screaming my head off. But they came across as very calm. They came under heavy fire. The bullets kept coming. You could hear them. You could see them sparking off the ground. And so the chief correspondent and the cameraman were both hit, but they were wearing body armor and helmets. And the 5 crew managed to escape into, I think, a factory, a warehouse, or a garage where some mechanics were working before they were evacuated many hours later by the police and taken to safety. And this really brings home how dangerous it is in the Ukraine, the level of violence that the Russian forces are using. And of course, what journalists in the region are facing every single day. So more power to the crew. I think it was Stuart Ramsey. All power to them. I'm so glad that they are safe, the 5 crew, the 5-man team that were out in the field. And, you know, thank you to them for continuing to tell the story of what's happening there. But I'm so glad that they got away safely.
Yeah, they definitely did. It's Stuart Ramsey, is producer Dominique, Martin Valls, and also the cameraman Richie Mockley, who, as you said, kept recording just incredible footage. As I said, viewers, if you do want to see that, you'll find it on skynews.com. And Thomas, I mean, Afua mentioned it there. This just highlights the dangers of reporting this story, reporting from an active war zone. Those guys are all veterans of war zones. They know how to handle themselves, but it's really dangerous out there. We've seen lots of news of, you know, of journalists who are living and working in bomb shelters, essentially, in the capital, Kiev. It's a really difficult situation to bring this story to the world, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, the story I was just going to talk about now is also, you know, domestically in Russia as well, how much more difficult that process is becoming of being a journalist on the ground in Ukraine. I can't imagine the challenges that are faced there, and also the ethical challenges facing journalists every single day as to, you know, the risks that they're putting themselves in and the risks that pose to them and their families. And it is a duty and it is a public service for journalists to be in the ground in places like Ukraine and war zones across the world. And that comes at a price, and that is a price, no doubt, for the family of all the people, or the family of all the crew that you mentioned there, sitting at home, terrified night after night for their own family. And as actually at the end of that report acknowledged, and it was right to do so, that these are increasingly the everyday experiences of ordinary Ukrainian people. It can be very easy, I suppose, as a journalist, or indeed anyone in a war zone like that, to sort of place yourself at the centre of that story. But what that report did so well was ensure that it reflected the fact that these were the everyday experiences of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian people. And indeed, many of them are not nearly as lucky as that particular crew who managed to escape, as Afua said, into a nearby warehouse and be evacuated by police a number of hours later. So the danger that journalists in the Ukraine and in Russia as well are putting themselves into, in the yesterday, just the lower house of parliament in Russia, the Duma, passed legislation where journalists accused of spreading what they call fake news could be imprisoned for up to 15 years. And as you would expect, that definition of fake news is left entirely within the hands of the Russian authorities. BBC News taken off the air there, increasingly Western broadcasters, CBS, CNN, ABC, removing their operations. BBC actually placing its Russian language news site on the dark web in Russia to facilitate that surge of hundreds of thousands of millions of Russians attempting to access accurate information, rather than the propaganda that is being pushed towards them by the Russian government. The Russian government going to extreme steps to attempt to prevent their own population from finding out accurate information about what's happening in Ukraine, closing Facebook, closing Twitter. It's extraordinary. I mean, Russia was never a democracy, but in many ways it was not a typical sort of middle-income European country. And in the space of, 2 weeks, it has come to resemble a despotic totalitarian regime, not unlike that of North Korea. And what Putin clearly recognizes is the fact that this is not a war that is supported by ordinary Russian people. It is Putin's war. And that may be something that comes back to bite him in the end. Having said that, my fear is, I suppose, that does Putin care? Does he care about what his population think? Does he even care what Russian oligarchs think? Yeah. And what kind of impact will those sanctions have if this is a ego-driven war on behalf of a Russian dictator?
It's purely ego, and it is really, he's shown no regard for human life. So where he ends with this, who knows at this stage, right? Thomas, Afua, thank you very much for now. While you are watching Sky News Breakfast, do stay with us. Ahead in the next hour, Mariupol City Council is to open humanitarian corridors